The next book I read was Character Analysis by Wilhelm Reich, which he wrote when he was in his 30s and was first published in 1933. This is the third enlarged edition, which means that it has a bunch of extra stuff at the end of it that they added in afterwards in the 50s and stuff like that. Um, so it kind of has a few highlights for me. It's a very long book. It's 500 something pages long, and it's extremely dense to read, especially the stuff that he was writing on character analysis specifically. Toward the end, he gets into diagnosing and working with schizophrenic people and his methods of working with them. He also gets a little carried away with the orgone thing, which that ended up being a problem for him because, yeah, the orgone, whatever. If you read a little bit about Wilhelm Reich, he's a little bit of a different character. He came in around the turn of the century or he was born around the turn of the century and wrote this book after World War One, when capitalism was really kicking off, and society was solidifying into what we know today, but was at the time a very different society, a very new kind of society that people were not necessarily used to, the industrialized capitalist society, which he goes into that. In his terminology, like many other psychologists that I've read, they tend to take a word and make it mean what they want it to mean. Like he uses the term sex economy. He's not talking about economizing sex. He's not talking about that. He's talking about, or the supply and demand of sex. He's talking about how the new economy messes with the society and the morals of the society to make the what are base sexual instincts into it represses those and it messes with those, and he uses that to get into his theory of masochism and why people that are masochistic are that way, which I thought was very, very interesting. If you read the first, I think it's the first like 130 pages, I think it's the first, might be 200 pages, he's talking specifically about character analysis, which from everything I've read, even from people that didn't like him, they said that he was an exceptional psychologist, and was an expert at character analysis and reading people and figuring out what was driving them and what was the basis of their neurosis or their psychosis, and he gets into that. What I was struck by was that it seemed as if he was trying to describe in words an intuitive process that he had no way of really describing in words. So when you're reading through the character analysis section of the book, it's sometimes very difficult to grasp what he's saying, not because he doesn't know what he's saying, but because there aren't words to describe the intuitive feelings that got him to the conclusions that he arrived at of why those people were doing what they were doing or why they were reacting the way they were reacting. And it's just it was very interesting to read that and then kind of look at, well, why is he saying what he's saying? Why is that the way he's describing it? Then he moved from there into talking about masochism. He has a fairly large section on masochism. And he was at odds with Freud in that he believed that masochism was not. So Freud believed that that masochism in people was a built-in death wish. That we all have the death wish, the wish to die existentially on some level or another. Reich disagreed with that. He said, if we all had a death wish, wouldn't we all just kill ourselves? Which is a really solid point. But Freud at that time was very well recognized, and you didn't really go against his ideas. And so while Reich was a huge fan of Freud, Freud was not a huge fan of Reich. And at this time, Reich was also developing his theory on the orgone energy, which we'll get into a little bit later. Anyway, so he described masochism as not the desire to be hurt or to feel pain, but more if I feel this pain, it will be less pain than if I feel the thing that I'm anticipating I could feel, right? And he worked this all the way back to childhood, where so corporal punishment, spanking, beating, that kind of thing was starting to really come into mainstream society, where it wasn't just the father abusing the kid. It was accepted as, this is the way that you punish your kid or you deal with your kid to get them to behave better. You hit them. And that was not a new idea, but it was being accepted in society, and so people were kind of embracing it. It wasn't just the drunken rage that somebody got hit by their dad, or whatever. It was, this is the norm. This is what you're supposed to do. And he looked at it as a way for children so the child thought that the father was going to damage their genitalia, like hit them in the genitalia. And so they would turn over and get hit in the backside, which he was saying that was the truest expression of, I'll take this pain so I don't have to have that pain. The pain of what he calls the castration anxiety, which Freud was really into the castration anxiety, and they talk about everything basing out of childhood sex and sexuality. And Reich got a little carried away with the whole childhood sex and sexuality thing. He was definitely off the mark there. But he based the masochism back to that, and then started showing that different people's behaviors as they grew up, they would get themselves in these masochistic cycles, whether it didn't have to necessarily be hitting or striking or whatever it was. It could be a relationship that was self-destructive to the person, and they would rather feel that pain than actually open themselves up and be emotionally castrated by the person they were in the relationship with, right? So he was talking about how masochism can come in different forms and be a different thing, which it was an interesting thought. It definitely, I agreed with where he went with it. But more to the point, it triggered me to think about the idea that, so delayed gratification in life is something that I feel very strongly is a way to help you become more successful. If you're not constantly looking for the quick fix and the quick pleasure and the quick gratification of, I saw this thing in the store and I wanted to buy it, so I just went and I bought it, right? And now I'm in debt because I went and bought the thing, right? You have all of the problems of instant gratification. That's just kind of a simple example, kind of a benign example, if you will, but it could go all the way to, he talks about the masochism of people in their sexual lives, where they build up towards climax, then they don't actually climax, and they come back down, they build up and they come down, and they build up and they come down, and they build up and they come down, and then by the time they actually climax, the climax it's not a climax, it's worthless, it's useless, and they feel horrible about themselves, and they go back to feeling terrible and guilty and dark and shameful and all that stuff. Everything sex should not be. And he was saying that, anyway, he was talking about that, and that sparked in my mind, I wonder if you took delayed gratification, the idea of delayed gratification, which is such a powerful idea and such a great way to control yourself in business, in life, in work, in whatever. You don't go for the immediate pleasure now. You put off that pleasure for a few years, and you work hard and you grind and you do your thing, and then you get that freedom that you worked for, but you've delayed the gratification of that freedom or the appearance of that freedom for a long time. And my thought was, I wonder if you take delayed gratification to the extreme, if that's just another form of masochism, where you delay the gratification and delay the gratification. You never ever realize the dream that you had. You never get to the goal. You never get to the freedom. You never get to the being able to travel the world or be a millionaire and retire at age 40, or whatever your dreams are, whatever your goals are. Be able to have a gym that works, that runs itself and that people pay the right amount of money for, and is just streamlined and works and is a good business model and helps people and actually produces something. Whatever your dream tends to be, that you're delaying the gratification of realizing that dream. The risk, I think, is that if you took that to the extreme where you were living in the process of delaying the gratification, and that was your gratification, the delay of the gratification, then I think that becomes another form of masochism. Anyway, that was just a thought that I had while I was reading it. He doesn't go into that at all in the book, but that was just a kind of a side thought that I had on that. Then he goes from there into the schizophrenic. Actually, he talks about the orgone energy for a while and the vegetative current, which he really got carried away with the whole orgone energy thing. I do believe there is inherently energy in our body that can be measured electrically. But not, I don't believe it. They've proven it. Like, it's just a thing that they've proven, that you have electrical signals in your body that that give off current and give off whatever. He believed that the orgone energy was sexual energy. And he goes through a whole thing of physical armoring, which the physical armoring thing was so interesting because it is actually true, and it works. The way he went about fixing it and solving it, I'm not sold on, mostly because it was really unethical and damaging to his patients mentally and emotionally and physically in some cases. He had a lot of people that brought lawsuits against him and his co-workers for traumatizing their kids and stuff, doing weird physical stuff to their kids and sexually abusing their kids and stuff in the course of trying to unblock their physical armoring. But his observations of the physical armoring were very, very interesting. He said it starts at the head. It starts up here. Your first blockage is in the head and the eye, under the eyes and the cheeks, and then it moves down to the chin and underneath, and then the neck and the throat. And then it moves down to the chest, and then it moves to the diaphragm, and then from there it moves down into the stomach, and then from there it moves down toward the pelvis. He said the pelvis is the last place that's blocked that needs to be unblocked, which you can see where that would go wrong really quickly if you felt free to just manually unblock somebody's pelvis. And so at the time, there were not really laws about this, and because of how repressed society was sexually, they didn't talk about it, they didn't want to go there, they didn't want to do any of that stuff. And so they thought he was crazy, and he was crazy, but he was diagnosed by a couple of his friends as schizophrenic, which he turned out later to end up being schizophrenic. Anyway, which was evidenced by his later life. But as far as the physical armoring goes, that section on the physical armoring is incredibly good as far as the intuition that he had to be able to tell that those were the locations that people locked their emotions that they couldn't deal with and they couldn't handle. They locked them into a physical place in their body and held them physically in their bodies so they didn't have to feel those emotions. That was an incredible discovery. And if he'd gone about it a little bit differently, I'm sure that he would have been more widely accepted. But like a lot of great psychiatrists and psychologists, he has a lot of issues. He had a lot of issues to work out as well personally, which he never really did work out. Anyway, so he moves from there to the schizophrenic split and talking about schizophrenic patients. And apparently he had really, really good success with schizophrenics, dealing with schizophrenic patients. And without medication, without a lot of that stuff, without electroshock, without water therapy, without, a lot of the therapies that came into practice in the 50s and the 60s and stuff like that. And some of it, I think, based on reading his work, he could rationalize what the schizophrenic people were doing and saying. He could rationalize where they were coming from, and he could work on their level to an extent that other people couldn't. Either they didn't have the patience, or they weren't open-minded enough, or they weren't crazy enough, or they weren't whatever it was. But he was able to find sense and find reason in the schizophrenic rantings and what's called schizophrenies, their language that they speak in. And he was able to help multiple people avoid being in an asylum and reintegrate into society as normal people. And unfortunately, it seems like his work on that was either ignored or lost or something. Until later, I was just watching this movie called Mad to Be Normal, where another psychiatrist tried something very, very similar in a different way years later in the 1960s and 70s, in what's called Kingsley Hall in England, where he basically had a community of schizophrenic and mentally ill patients live together and only used LSD as a way to unblock their locked emotions and their problems and their whatever. But he would very similarly let the schizophrenics live out their fantasies and live out their delusions of grandeur to the extent that they could without hurting themselves or other people. Anyway, and it was interesting, and it seems very... it doesn't seem like many people are adopting that kind of take on it, because it's not the popular take, because it doesn't come with medications that can sell and make money like everything else. It's a capitalist society, so research is driven by the people that have the money. Anyway, all that to say, that's kind of a sidetrack, but his work on schizophrenia was very, very interesting. A postscript to this review of the book character analysis is very, very good. It's worth reading. I would say from what I saw, it's the only book of his worth reading. He self-published quite a few books because no one would publish him because they didn't like his ideas and because he was crazy, and increasingly so past his 30s. He did only live till he was about 57. But that is not to say that his work done in his 30s was to be discarded. It was extremely good work, and this book is probably the best representation of his stuff. So I would definitely read the book if you get the chance. There's a couple of movies that were made about him and his son and cloud busting and doing a lot of stuff like that, kind of funky stuff where he thought he was using orgone energy to break up clouds, to disperse clouds in the sky, or to bring rain, or stuff that, hey, maybe it's true. Maybe in 100 years or 50 years or whatever, they figure out that really he was onto something and that it was really true what he was doing, and that, man, he was really connected and figured it out. But it doesn't seem like it's realistic. And it doesn't seem terribly scientific. A lot of the way he ran around trying to find orgone energy and prove that it was there was fairly unscientific, and he ended up getting chucked out of a couple of different labs and seminars based on that lack of scientific method. All of that to say, the man was brilliant, and for someone in their 30s nowadays to produce this work, yeah, it just, my mind reels. The guy was incredibly intelligent, which is, he could have just been schizophrenic before the break. Anyway, the book is definitely worth reading. You're going to have to take your time. You're going to have to pay attention because there's a lot of stuff in there and it moves really quick. But it's worth it.